In this unit, we'll discuss how to conduct a safety risk assessment, and it is a 5-step process. Step 1 is the planning stage. We're going to put a plan together and detail the goals and objectives of the SRA. And we're going to use data sources, data analysis, and documentation to help achieve the goals and objectives of SRA. You also need to get management approval and inform the employees about what's going on. Let them know that you're conducting a preliminary hazard identification process to reduce risks, and it provides transparency and also allows employees to provide some valuable feedback that might be needed when we put this SRA together. Step 2 is hazard identification and analysis. We need to identify hazards, and a hazard is an event, condition, or circumstance that can lead to a loss. And the data for that can be derived from a bunch of different sources: observations, audits, safety surveys, investigations, research. We can get factual briefings from frontline personnel and subject matter experts. Brainstorming, where people just sit around a table and then brainstorm and come up with different ideas. And also some of the more formal tools, such as analysis tools, including event trees, fault trees, FMECAs, or failure modes and effect criticality analysis. We can use tools like that as well. We developed the preliminary hazard list, the PHL, and that's going to be a list of potential or known hazards. Then we're going to conduct a preliminary hazard analysis, the PHA. We go into what-if scenarios. So we have an example here. The airport's painted signs are weathered. All right, so we can look at that and say, okay, well, that's a hazard. And that is... maybe it's not a hazard. Maybe it doesn't exist yet, but what would happen if the signs were weathered? All right. So that's what we're looking to do here is look into, well, what could happen? And the PHA is a living document, and it's determined by a team or a committee, usually. Step 3 is risk assessment. Now we look at the risk associated with the hazard, and the risk is the consequence of a hazard, and risk is measured in terms of severity and probability. We know that risks need to be mitigated. The level of risk may be determined using a risk matrix, which we'll discuss next. There's an initial risk assessment, and then we're going to do a closing risk assessment. And there's probably going to be some residual risk, and the question then is, can we live with it? Sometimes we can, and then sometimes we can't. It really depends on what the situation is. So here's a safety risk severity table, and I'm not going to read all of these to you, but on this, the left side right here, we have severity of occurrence and what could happen, the worst case scenario. Catastrophic, obviously, is really bad. Down to negligible, little consequences. And then everything in between, as you can see. And then there's a alpha value assigned to these different categories. So if something is hazardous, it fits one of these categories here, we would assign that an alpha character of B Bravo for the severity. Then we have the probability table. What are the chances of something happening? And they can range from frequent down to extremely improbable. And here are the meanings right here. And again, we have a value. So this is numeric. This would be the numeric part of the alphanumeric code. So something that could happen frequently would be assigned a 5 value, and then if it's something that's extremely improbable, something that probably would never occur, we would just give that a value of 1. And this is what it might look like when we look at the risk matrix, where we see the alphanumeric values, and then they're color-coded. What are we going to do about it? So obviously, things that fall into the red category need immediate attention. Those are risks that are very likely to happen, and if they do happen, they're going to be pretty catastrophic. And then we have yellow, which at that point we're going to put controls in place. We're going to get management approval. There could be a cost benefit analysis involved with that, but the yellows aren't quite as bad as the reds, but definitely something that has to be looked at, mitigated, and then monitored closely. And then the greens, anything that falls into the green category generally is acceptable, and no further action is needed generally. So those are the low likelihood, low consequence type of events. Here's some suggested criteria for what management or the safety manager in unison with upper management should be doing. It's a safety risk tolerability matrix. And then we have the intolerable region. As I said earlier, these would be the reds, and then they're unacceptable under the existing circumstances. So something has to be done very quickly on those. The tolerable region was the yellow, and acceptable based on risk mitigation, and it may require management decision. And then the green are acceptable, generally things that are nothing more than an inconvenience. But again, all of these things can be and are dynamic, and they can change over time. Greens can turn into yellows, yellows can turn into reds, and so on and so forth, even the opposite way, which is typically when we do put risk controls in place. So it could go from red to yellow to green, and then green to yellow to red, depending on what it is. Here's another version of the risk analysis matrix, and this is just this is a 5x5 matrix. Typically, the 4x4 is used, but this is a 5x5. And it's not alphanumeric, it's just numeric. And again, it's the same type of idea with the color coding where, the numbers over here would be added to the probability of occurrence, and then we come up with a number. Maybe it's a 9, maybe it's a 20. So it's really just a different version that you might see out there of something that we've already talked about. Let's work a few examples now. So the question is, what is the hazard? And the hazard is a thunderstorm. So what are the risks? Well, obviously flying into a thunderstorm can cause a bad day for pilots and airplanes, loss of control, or hail, a lot of risks associated with it. So, how are we going to mitigate those risks? What kind of risk controls? Well, just and there's different types, but let's just say that the aircraft is equipped with weather radar. And, especially if it's an embedded thunderstorm, not a thunderstorm like this where it's clearly visible and you can see it and avoid it, but, embedded thunderstorms. So we have technology in the aircraft, weather radar, that will help us to avoid flying through thunderstorms. So that would be one of the risk controls to prevent the flight or the pilots from entering a thunderstorm. Usually it's unintentionally, although some pilots have flown through thunderstorms intentionally, even with radar. So, no matter how much you do, sometimes other decisions are made instead. Here's another example. We talked a little bit about this before. Here's a sign at an airport or taxiway, and it's the number 5. And the hazard is the fact that there's growth. There's weeds, grass, vegetation growing on the sign. So what are the risks? Well, just to come up with a quick off-the-cuff risk would be, let's say pilots miss the sign. They don't see it. And then they taxi down a wrong taxiway. All right, so how are the risks mitigated? What are the controls? Well, this one's really easy. All we have to do is get the gardeners out there, the lawns people, and clean this up. And now we have completely eliminated the hazard and the risks associated with it. Okay, it's just a simple matter of whacking the weeds on the sign. Now, it's interesting because this would put this into a category of green on the risk matrix. But if this is not maintained and they continue or they don't continue to do the proper groundskeeping and keep this thing all trimmed up here, then what's going to happen is this risk will now go back up into a yellow and possibly a red. So that's why we always want to have continuous monitoring to make sure that greens stay in the green. And if they don't, then we need to take further action. In this case would be to cut the grass again. And here's one more example. This one is, you've probably seen this somewhere. This is St. Bart's, an island in the Caribbean. And the hazard is that when airplanes land here in this direction, they have to fly over a very steep hill. So obviously the risks, there's many risks involved here, mostly hard landings or runway excursions, and that's happened, of course, a number of times here at this airport. Very tricky. So the question is, how are the risks mitigated? What type of risk controls can we use? Well, one of them, and again, there's more, but one of those risk controls is that in order to fly in there, the pilots that are going into this particular airport have to get a checkout and be approved from a local examiner that conducts these check rides or these proficiency checks that for this particular airport, because it can be very tricky and you can cause a lot of problems if you don't fly into this airport right on the money. So that would be how we can control some of the risk associated with this airport that has a very steep descent angle as you have to clear this mountain just before the runway. So now we get up to step 4, decide and report. Now we have the information. What do we do? Well, are there immediate potentially consequential risks? Should we act or not? So those are just, hypothetical questions. Reporting, there's documentation. We may need to present cases to management for approval. Cost benefit, is it proactive? Is it reactive? How do we implement the changes? So, these are just questions that need to be answered or things that need to be looked at. This is the process of safety risk management. And once again, I'm not going to read all these to you, but it's just basically a flow chart, and it's very good because it gives you an idea of, what it goes from hazard identification to the risk control and mitigation. So just something for a reference for you. Here's another way of looking at it, the safety risk mitigation process. It's kind of similar to what we just looked at, just a little bit different presentation, the hazard consequence identification and risk assessment. Okay, H is hazard, R is risk, and then the assessment of the defenses within the system that are in place, the control and mitigation of the risks, where do we fall in this category, and then of course accepting the mitigation of the risks. Is it working? Is it effective? So on and so forth. So it is a feedback loop here with safety assurance. As I said, this is a living process. It's not just to do it once and put it away type thing. So right here, we're looking at the upside down pyramid with the regions of intolerable, tolerable, and acceptable. Remember the ALARP principle, as low as reasonably practicable. Practicable That means that, we're going to reduce the risk as much as we can to a point where we may not be able to reduce that risk any further. So you may need to conduct a cost benefit analysis. In other words, how much is it going to cost to reduce maybe just the risk a little bit more than it's already been reduced? Obviously, if the cost is going to be very significant and the benefit's going to be kind of low, it may not be worth doing. So that's why when we talk about ALARP, we're going to do the best we can. And you might remember the scales we talked about before with production and protection. We want to keep those scales balanced between safety and output. And so that's why sometimes it may come down to, okay, well, let's do this cost benefit analysis and see, if we can really do this and if it's worth it. And continuing on cost benefit analysis, what are the direct costs? Okay, they relate mostly to physical damage and include rectifying, replacing, or compensating for injuries, aircraft equipment, and property damage. Insurance pays for much of this, but insurance should not be viewed as a substitute for effective safety risk management processes. And what are the indirect costs? Remember, there's when we talk about cost benefit, the costs, some of them are going to be intangible. Okay, we don't really, it's kind of hard to quantify them, but if you look at loss of business and damage to the reputation of the organization, loss of use of equipment, loss of staff productivity, and so on and so forth here. I mean, it goes on and on. Then obviously, there's a lot of costs involved that are direct as well as indirect costs. So all these things have to be taken into consideration when we do a cost benefit analysis. Other considerations would be managerial as a safety risk consistent with the organization's safety policy and objectives. The legal aspect is a safety risk in conformance with current regulatory standards and enforcement capabilities. And cultural, how will the organization's personnel and other stakeholders view the safety risk? You may have pushback from people, employees or stakeholders or shareholders. They may not agree with the exposure of risk for this particular organization. The market, will the organization's competitiveness and well-being vis-a-vis other organizations be compromised by the safety risk? The political, will there be a political price to pay for not addressing the safety risk? And then the public, how influential will the media or special interest groups be in affecting public opinion regarding the safety risk? Lots of things to think about. And then finally, we have step 5, which is evaluation. And this is just the continuous monitoring, validation, monitoring, and feedback. Is it working? Monitoring provides a method to know if the system's working. Get feedback from the people who use the systems or do the tasks, the actual hands-on people. Understand that new risks may arise in the future and may have to be analyzed and added to your list. SRA is a living system. Thank you.